Peter Pan by J. M. Barrie. Part 6. Chapter 12. The children are carried off. The pirate attack had been a complete surprise, a sure proof that the unscrupulous Hook had conducted it improperly, for to surprise redskins fairly is beyond the wit of man. By all the unwritten laws of savage warfare, it is always the redskin who attacks, and with the willingness of their race, he does it just before dawn, at which time he knows the courage of the others to be at their lowest ebb. The others have in the meantime made a rude stockade on the summit of yonder undulating ground, at the foot of which a stream runs, for it is destruction to be too far from water. There they await the onslaught, the inexperienced ones clutching their revolvers and treading on twigs, but the old hands sleeping tranquilly until just before the dawn. Through the long black night, the scouts wriggle snake-like among the grass without stirring a blade. The brushwood closes behind them, as silently as sand into which a mole has dived. Not a sound is to be heard, save for when they give vent to a wonderful imitation of the lonely call of the coyote. The cry is answered by other braves, and some of them do it even better than the coyotes, who are not very good at it. So the chill hours wear on, and the long suspense is horribly trying to the others who have had to live through it for the first time. But to the trained hand, those ghostly falls, still ghastlier silences, are but an imitation of how long the night is marching. That this was the usual procedure was so well known to Hook that in disregarding it he cannot be excused on the plea of ignorance. The redskins, on their part, trusted implicitly to his honor, and their whole action of the night stands out in marked contrast to his. They left nothing undone that was consistent with the reputation of their tribe. With that alertness of senses which is at once the marvel and despair of other peoples, they knew that the pirates were on the island from the moment one of them trod on a dry stick, and in an increasingly short space of time the coyote cries began. Every foot of ground between the spot where Hook had landed his forces and the home under the trees was stealthily examined by the braves wearing their moccasins, with the heels in front. They found only one hillock with a stream at its base, so that Hook had no choice. Here he must establish himself and wait for just before the dawn. Everything being thus mapped out with the almost diabolical cunning, the main body of the redskins folded their blankets around them, and, in the phlegmatic manner that is to them, the pearl of manhood squatted above the children's home, awaiting the cold moment when they should deal pale death. Here dreaming, though wide awake, of the exquisite tortures to which they were going to put him at the break of day, those confiding peoples were found by the treacherous Hook. From the accounts afterwards supplied by such of the scouts as escaped the carnage, it does not seem to have even paused at the rising ground, though it is certain that in the grey light he must have seen it. No thought of waiting to be attacked appears from first to last to have visited his subtle mind. He would not even hold off till the night was nearly spent. On he pounded with no policy but to fall to. What could the bewildered scouts do, masters as they were of every warlike artifice save this one, but to trot helplessly after him, exposing themselves fatally to view, while they gave up a pathetic utterance to the coyote cry? Around the brave tiger lily were a dozen of her stoutest warriors, and they suddenly saw the perfidious pirates bearing down on them. Fell from their eyes then the film through which they had looked at victory. No more would they torture at the stake. For them the happy hunting grounds was now. They knew it, but as their father's sons they acquitted themselves. Even then they had time to gather a phalanx that would have been hard to break had they risen quickly, but this they were forbidden to do by the traditions of their race. It is written they must never express surprise in the presence of another. Thus, terrible as the sudden appearance of the pirates must have been to them, they remained stationary for a moment, not a muscle moving, as if their foe had come by invitation. Then, indeed, the tradition gallantly upheld, they seized their weapons, and the air was torn with the war cry. But it was now too late. It is no part of ours to describe what was a massacre rather than a fight. Thus perished many of the flower of the redskin tribe. Not all unavenged did they die, for with Lean Wolf fell Alf Manson to disturb the Spanish Main no more, and among others who were bit the dust were Geo, Scoury, Chaz, Turley, and Altassian Fogarty. Turley fell to the tomahawk of terrible Panther, who ultimately cut a way through the pirates with Tiger Lily and a small remnant of the tribe. To what extent Hook is to blame for his tactics on this occasion, it is for the historians to decide. Had he waited on the rising ground to the proper hour, he and his men would have probably been butchered, and in judging him it is only fair to take this into account. What he should perhaps have done was to acquaint his opponents that he proposed to follow a new method. On the other hand, this, as destroying the element of surprise, would have made his strategy of no avail, so that the whole question is beset with difficulties. One cannot at least withdraw a reluctant admiration for the wit that had conceived so bold a scheme, and the fell genius with which it is carried out. What were his own feelings about himself at that triumphant moment? Fain would his dogs have known, as breathing heavily and wiping their cutlasses, they gathered at a discreet distance from his hook, and squinted through their ferreted eyes at this extraordinary man. Elation must have been in his heart, but his face did not reflect it. Ever as dark and solitary enigma, he stood aloof from his followers in spirit as in substance. The night's work was not over, for it was not the redskins he had come out to destroy, but they were bees to be smoked, so that he should get at the honey. It was Pan he wanted. Pan and Wendy and their band, but chiefly Pan. Peter was such a small boy that one tends to wonder at the man's hatred of him. True, he had flung Hook's arm to the crocodile, but even this, and the increased insecurity of life to which it led, owing to the crocodile's pertinacity, hardly accounted for the vindictiveness so relentless and malignant. The truth is that there was something about Peter which goaded the pirate captain into a frenzy. It was not his courage, it was not his engaging appearance, it was not— there is no beating about the bush. We know quite well what it was, and have got to tell. It was Peter's cockiness. This had got on Hook's nerves. It made his iron claw twitch, and at night it disturbed him like an insect. While Peter lived, the tortured man felt he was a lion in a cage into which the sparrow had come. The question now was how to get down the trees, or how to get his dogs down. He ran his greedy eyes over them, searching for the thinnest ones. They wriggled uncomfortably, for they knew he would not scruple to ram them down the poles. In the meantime, what of the boys? We have seen them at the first clang of the weapons, turned, as it were, to stone figures, open-mouthed, all appealing with outstretched arms to Peter. And we returned them as their mouths closed, their arms fall to their sides. The pandemonium above has ceased, almost as suddenly as it arose, passed like a fierce gust of wind, but they know in the passing it has determined their fate. Which side has won? The pirates, listening avidly to the mouths of the tree, heard the question put by every boy, and alas, they also heard Peter's answer. "If the redskins have won," he said, "they will beat the tom-tom. It is always their sign of victory." Now Smee found the tom-tom, and it was that moment sitting on it. "You will never hear that tom-tom again," he muttered, inaudibly, of course, for strict silence had been enjoined. To his amazement, Hook signed to him to beat the tom-tom, and slowly there came to Smee an understanding of the dreadful wickedness of the order. Never, probably, had this simple man admired Hook so much. Twice Smee beat upon the instrument, and then stopped to listen gleefully. "The tom-tom!" the miscreants heard Peter cry. "An Indian victory!" The doomed children answered with a cheer that was music to the black hearts above, and almost immediately they repeated their goodbyes to Peter. This puzzled the pirates, But all their other feelings were swallowed by a base delight that the enemy were about to come up the trees. They smirked at each other and rubbed their hands. Rapidly and silently Hook gave his orders, one man to each tree, the others to arrange themselves in 2 lines, yards apart. Chapter 13. Do you believe in fairies? The more quickly this horror is disposed of, the better. The first to emerge from his tree was Curly. He rose out of it into the arms of Kiseko, who flung him to Smee, who flung him to Starkey, who flung him to Bill Jukes, who flung him to Noodler, and so he was tossed from one to another, till he fell at the feet of the black pirate. All the boys were plucked from their trees in this ruthless manner, several of them in the air at the time, like bales of goods flung from hand to hand. A different treatment was accorded to Wendy, who came last. With ironical politeness, Hook raised his hat to her, and then offered her his arm, escorted her to the spot where the others were being gagged. He did it with such an air, and he was so frightfully distinguished, that she was too fascinated to cry out. She was only a little girl. Perhaps it is telltale to have divulged that for a moment Hook entranced her, and we tell on her only because of her slip led to strange results. Had she haughtily unhanded him, and we should have loved to have righted of her, she would have been hurled through the air like the others, and then Hook would have probably not been present at the tying of the children, and had he not been at the tying, he would not have discovered Slightly's secret, and without the secret he could not presently have made his foul attempt on Peter's life. They were tied to prevent flying away, and doubled up with their knees close to their ears. For the trussing of them, the black pirate had cut a rope into 9 equal pieces. All went well until Slightly's turn came, when he was found to be like those irritating parcels that use up all the string in going around and around, and leave no tags with which to tie a knot. The pirates kicked him in their rage, just as you kick a parcel, though in fairness you should kick the string. And strange to say, it was Hook who took them to belay their violence. His lip was curled with malicious triumph, while his dogs were merely sweating because every time they tried to pack the unhappy lad tight into one part, he bulged out in another. Hook's mastermind had gone far beneath Slightly's surface, probing not for effects, but for causes, and his exultation showed that he had found them. Slightly, white to the gills, knew that Hook had surprised his secret, which was this: no boy so blown out could use a tree wherein an average man needs stick. Poor Slightly, the most wretched of the children now, for he was in a panic about Peter, bitterly regretted what he had done. Madly addicted to drinking water when he was hot, he had swelled in consequence to his present girth, and instead of reducing himself to fit his tree, he had, unknowingly to the others, whittled his tree to make it fit him. Sufficient of this Hook guessed to persuade him that Peter at last lay at his mercy, but no word of the dark design that now formed in the subterranean caverns of his mind crossed his lips. He merely signed that the captives were to be conveyed to the ship, and that he would be alone. How to convey them? Hunched up in their ropes, they might indeed be rolled down the hill like barrels, but most of the way lay through a morass. Again Hook's genius surmounted the difficulties. He indicated that the little house must be used as a conveyance. The children were flung into it. 4 stout pirates raised it on their shoulders, and the others fell in behind, and singing the hateful pirate chorus, a strange progression set off through the wood. I don't know whether any of the children were crying. If so, the singing drowned out the sound. But as the little house disappeared into the forest, a brave thought, though tiny jet of smoke issued from its chimney, as if defying Hook. Hook saw it, and did Peter a bad service. It dried up any trickle of pity for him that may have remained in the pirate's infuriated breast. The first thing he did on finding himself alone at the fast-falling night was to tiptoe to Slightly's tree, and make sure that it provided him with a passage. Then for long he remained brooding, his hat of ill omen on the sward, so that any gentle breeze which had arisen might play refreshingly through his hair. Dark were his thoughts as his blue eyes were soft and periwinkle. Intently he listened for any sound from the netherworld, but all was silent below as above. The house under the ground seemed to be one more empty tenement in the void. Was that boy asleep, or did he stand waiting at the foot of Slightly's tree with his dagger in his hand? There was no way of knowing save by going down. Hook let his cloak slip softly to the ground, then, biting his lip till a lewd blood stood on them, he stepped into the tree. He was a brave man, but for a moment he had to stop there and wipe his brow, which was dripping like a candle. Then, silently, he let himself go into the unknown. He arrived unmolested at the foot of the shaft, and stood still again, biting at his breath, which had almost left him. As his eyes became accustomed to the dim light, various objects in the home under the trees took shape, but the only one on which his greedy gaze rested, long sought for and found at last, was the great bed, and on the bed lay Peter, fast asleep. Unaware of the tragedy being enacted above, Peter had continued, for a little time after the children left, to play gaily on his pipes, no doubt a rather forlorn attempt to prove himself that he did not care. Then he decided not to take his medicine so as to grieve Wendy. Then he lay down on the bed, outside the coverlet, to vex her more, for she had always tucked them inside it, because you never know that you may not grow chilly at the turn of the night. Then he had nearly cried, but it struck him how indignant she would be, and he laughed instead. So he laughed a hearty laugh, and fell asleep in the middle of it. Sometimes, though not often, he had dreams, and they were more painful than the dreams of other boys. For hours he could not be separated from these dreams, though he wailed piteously in them. They had to do, I think, with the riddle of his existence. At such times it had been Wendy's custom to take him out of bed and sit with him on her lap, soothing him in a dear way of her own invention, and, when he grew calmer, to put him back to bed before he had quite woken up, so that he should not know of the indignity to which she had subjected him. But on this occasion he had fallen asleep at once into a dreamless sleep. One arm dropped over the edge of the bed, one leg was arched, and the unfinished part of his laugh was stranded on his mouth, which was open, showing the little pearls. Thus, defenceless, Hook found him. He stood silently at the foot of the tree, looking across the chamber at his enemy. Did no feeling of compassion disturb his sombre breast? The man was not wholly evil. He loved flowers, I have been told, and sweet music. He himself was no mean performer on the harpsichord, and, let it be frankly admitted, the idyllic nature of the scene stirred him profoundly. Mastered by his better self, he would have returned reluctantly up the tree, but for one thing. What stayed him was Peter's impertinent appearance as he slept. The open mouth, the drooping arm, the arched knee, they were such a personification of cockiness as, taken together, will never again, one may hope, be presented to the eyes so sensitive as their offensiveness. They steeled Hook's heart. If his rage had broken him into 100 pieces, every one of them would have disregarded the incident and leapt at the sleeper. Though a light from one lamp shone dimly on the bed, Hook stood in darkness himself, and at the first stealthy step forward he discovered an obstacle. The door of Slightly's tree. It did not entirely fill the aperture, and he had been looking over it. Feeling for the catch, he found to his fury that it was low down, beyond his reach. To his disordered brain it seemed then that the irritating quality in Peter's face and figure visibly increased, and he rattled the door and flung himself against it. Was his enemy to escape him after all? But what was that? The red in his eye caught sight of Peter's medicine standing on a ledge within easy reach. He fathomed what it was straight away, and immediately knew that the sleeper was in his power. Lest he should be taken alive, Hook always carried about his person a dreadful drug, blended by himself of all the death-dealing rings that had come into his possession, that he had boiled down into a yellow liquid quite unknown to science, which was probably the most virulent poison in existence. 5 drops of this now, he added to Peter's cup. His hand shook, but it was in exultation rather than shame. As he did it, he avoided glancing at the sleeper, but not lest pity should unnerve him, merely to avoid spilling. Then, one long, last gloating look he cast upon his victim, and turning, wormed his way with difficulty back up the tree. As he emerged at the top, he looked at the very spirit of evil breaking from its hole. Donning his hat at the most rakish angle, he wound his cloak around him, holding one end in front as if to conceal his person from the night, of which it was the blackest part, and muttering strangely to himself, stole away through the trees. Peter slept on. The light guttered and went out, leaving the tenement in darkness. But still he slept. It must have been not less than 10 o'clock by the crocodile when he sat up in his bed, wakened by he knew not what. It was a soft, cautious tapping on the door of his tree. Soft and cautious, but in that stillness it was sinister, and Peter felt for his dagger till he gripped it, then spoke. "Who is that?" For long there was no answer. Then again the knock. "Who are you?" No answer. He was thrilled, and he loved being thrilled. In 2 strides he reached the door, and like Slightly's door, filled the aperture so that he could not see beyond it, nor could the one knocking see him. "I won't open unless you speak," Peter cried. Then at last the visitor spoke in a lovely bell-like voice. "Let me in, Peter." It was Tink, and he quickly unbarred to her. She flew in excitedly, face flushed and her dress stained with mud. "What is it?" "Oh, you could never guess," she cried, and offered him 3 guesses. "Out with it," he shouted, and in one ungrammatical sentence, as long as the ribbons that conjurers pull from their mouths, she told of the capture of Wendy and the boys. Peter's heart bobbed up and down as he listened. Wendy bound on a pirate ship? She who loved everything to be just so? "I'll rescue her," he cried, leaping on his weapons. As he leapt, he thought of something he could do to please her. He could take his medicine. His hand closed upon the fatal draught. "No!" shrieked Tinker Bell, who had heard Hook mutter about his deed as he sped through the forest. "Why not? It's poisoned." "Poisoned? Who could have poisoned it?" "Hook." "Don't be silly. How could Hook got down here?" Alas, Tinker Bell could not explain this, for even she did not know the dark secrets of Slightly's tree. Nevertheless, Hook's words had left no room for doubt. The cup was poisoned. "Besides," said Peter, quite believing himself, never fell asleep. He raised the cup. No time for words now, no time for deeds, and with one of her lightning movements, Tink got between his lips and the draught, and drained it to the dregs. "Why, Tink, how dare you drink my medicine?" But she did not answer. Already she was reeling in air. "What's the matter with you?" Peter cried, suddenly afraid. "It was poisoned, Peter," she told him softly, "and now I am going to be dead." "Oh, Tink, did you drink it to save me?" "Yes." "But why, Tink?" Her wings would scarcely carry her now, but in reply she alighted on his shoulder and gave his nose a loving bite. She whispered in his ear, "You silly ass," and then tottering to her chamber, she lay down in the bed. His head almost filled the 4th wall of her little room as he knelt near her in distress. Every moment her light was growing fainter, and he knew that if it went out she would be no more. She liked his tears so much that she put out her beautiful finger and let them run over it. Her voice was so low that at first he could not make out what she said. Then he made it out. She was saying that she thought she could get well again if children believed in fairies. Peter flung out his arms. There were no children here. It was night time, but he addressed all who might be dreaming of the Neverland, and who were therefore nearer to him than you think. Boys and girls in their nighties, and naked papooses in their baskets hung from trees. "Do you believe?" he cried. Tink sat up in bed almost briskly to listen to her fate. She fancied she heard answers in the affirmative, and then again she wasn't sure. "What do you think?" she asked Peter. "If you believe," he shouted to them, "clap your hands. Don't let Tink die." Many clapped. Some didn't. Few beasts hissed. The clapping stopped suddenly, as if countless mothers had rushed to their nurseries to see what on earth was happening. But already Tink was saved. First her voice grew strong, then she popped out of bed, and then she was flashing through the room more merry and impudent than ever. She never thought of thanking those who believed, but she would have liked to get at the ones who had hissed. And now, to rescue Wendy. The moon was riding in a cloudy heaven when Peter rose from his tree, begirt with weapons and wearing little else, to set out upon a perilous quest. It was not such a night that he would have chosen. He had hoped to fly, keeping not far from the ground, so that nothing untoward should escape his eyes, but in that fitful light to have flown low would have meant trailing his shadow through the trees, thus disturbing the birds and acquainting a watchful foe that he was astir. He regretted now that he had given the birds of the island such strange names that are very wild and difficult to approach. There was no other course but to press forward in a redskin fashion, at which he happily was an adept. But in what direction? For he could not be sure that the children had been taken to the ship. A light fall of snow obliterated all footmarks, and a deathly silence pervaded the island. As if for a space nature stood still in horror of the recent carnage. He had taught the children something of the forest lore, and he had learned himself from Tiger Lily and Tinker Bell, and knew that in their dire hour they were not likely to forget it. Slightly, if he had the opportunity, would blaze the trees, for instance. Hurley would drop seeds, and Wendy would leave her handkerchief at some important place. The morning was needed to search for such guidance, but he could not wait. The upper world had called him, but he could give no help. The crocodile passed him, but not another living thing, not a sound, not a movement, and yet he knew well that sudden death might be at the next tree or stalking him from behind. He swore this terrible oath: "Hook or me this time." Now he crawled forward like a snake, and again erect, he darted across space on which the moonlight played, one finger on his lip, his dagger at the ready. He was frightfully happy.